Now, Paul's going to answer that question. And what advantage then did the Jew have? Now, follow me very carefully. Paul says, much every way, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God. Now, Paul is saying, yes, the Jew had an advantage. The advantage, however, created a responsibility. And this advantage is something that we need to note because there's more confusion in this area than any other. I know men teaching today in theological seminaries that make no distinction between Judaism in the Old Testament and the church in the New Testament at all. Now, Paul is making it clear here that God not only gave to the nation Israel the oracles of God, they were the ones that have communicated the Scriptures. They are the ones that got the Word of God. And not only that, Paul is saying that not only did he give them the Word of God, but in the Word of God there was something special for them, and that God is not through with the nation Israel. I always listen to these theologians today at that particular point. Does God have a future for Israel? And my friend, if God doesn't have a future for Israel, I don't think He has a future for you either, or that theological professor, because you base it on the same Word of God. And God is going to make John 3:16 good. And God's going to make the covenant He made with Abraham good in the 12th chapter of Genesis also. Listen again to Dr. Stifler as he wrote this. Speaking now of Israel, his advantage was not that God sowed Judaism and the world reaped Christianity. That blots out Judaism. It was first of all that unto them were committed the oracles of God, not that they were made a mere Bible depository, but that God gave them as Jews promises not yet fulfilled, and peculiarly their own. The Old Testament, the record of these oracles, contains not one promise either of or to the church as an organization. It does not predict the church. It foreshadows a kingdom in which the Jew shall be the head and not lose his national distinction as he does in the church. Now, friends, I think that's one of the most important and profound statements that have been made concerning the Word of God. And here is where your great theologians, well, they call themselves great, or let me put it like this, they call each other great. It's marvelous today how degrees are being handed out. One theologian gives another theologian a degree and pats him on the back, and then that fellow turns around and gives the other man who patted him on the back a degree. I'd be very frank with you, this is important, very important. Now, Dr. Schaeffer, Adolf Schaeffer, he was a converted Jew, and he's made this tremendous and poignant statement. Listen to it. The view that is so prevalent that Israel is the shadow of the church, and now that the type is fulfilled, vanishes from our horizon, is altogether unscriptural. Israel is not the shadow fulfilled and absorbed in the church, but the basis on which the church rests. Friends, that's an important statement, by the way. Now, that's what Paul is saying here. The Jew had a great advantage. God has a future for him, and that his faithlessness will not destroy God's promise. Listen to him. For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? If some were without faith, is better. Translation, shall their lack of faith cancel out the faithfulness of God? You see, this is another objection that would be put up, and Paul meets this by going back to the first. Now, if the advantage of the Jew did not serve the intended purpose, does this not mean God's faithfulness to his people is annulled? The Jew fail, then shouldn't God fail? No. God's promise to send Israel, the Redeemer, was not defeated by their willful disobedience and rejection. All his promises for the future of the nation will be fulfilled to his glory in spite of their unbelief. Now, my friend, you may not like that, but I personally thank God that his promises to me do not depend on my faithlessness. Oh, thank God for that. I'd have been lost long ago. Thank God for His faithfulness. Listen to Paul now. He says, God forbid. Yea, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. In other words, the unbeliever that raises this question is a liar, and God's going to make him out to be a liar someday. Why? Because the faithfulness of God is true and cannot be changed. How important that is. John says this in 1 John 5:10, He that believeth on the Son of God hath the witness in himself. He that believeth not God hath made him a liar, because he believeth not the record that God gave of His Son. How bad is it not to believe God today, that He gave His Son to die for you? Well, I'll tell you how bad it is. You make God a liar. And it's not nice to call somebody a liar, you see, but that's what you do when you reject His Son. Now, the whole point is this. All right, if my unrighteousness reveals the marvelous, wonderful, infinite faithfulness of God and the grace of God, then has God a right to judge me? That's what Paul is saying here. And by the way, as Dr. David Brown said years ago, this makes it very clear that the unsaved world in Paul's day understood Paul was preaching salvation by the grace of God. Now I'm going to pick up at verse 5. But if our unrighteousness commend the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous who taketh vengeance? I speak as a man. And this means that, does it establish? And Paul meets this objection here. You see, by some subtle sophistry, it might be argued that since the nation's unbelief merely puts in contrast the faithfulness of God, then God's not just to punish that which brings greater glory to Himself. In other words, the better translation is God unjust who visiteth with wrath for judging these people. Now, this is the severest criticism that Paul faced in preaching the gospel of the grace of God. If God uses sin to get glory to Himself, then He should not punish the sinner. This, of course, was used by some as an excuse for sinning. We'll find that again in Romans 6:1. We'll deal with it then. Paul asked the question in such a way in the Greek as to demand a negative answer. God is not unjust. He says, I speak as a man. Doesn't mean that Paul is not writing this particular passage by inspiration, but rather that he's presenting this question from the finite and human standpoint. Then in verse 6, God forbid. Then how shall God judge the world? Paul's answer is again an emphatic and categorical denial of any such premise that God's unjust. The argument here is that if this particular sin merely enhances the glory of God and the grace of God, then all sin would do the same. Therefore, God would not be able to judge the world. He would abdicate His throne as judge of all the earth. And every person acknowledges that there are some folk who should be judged. You see, this specious argument forbids their judgment. Hitler ought not to be judged.